Alrighty, I think I'm almost done. This brings us to a further parallel between Varela's theory of autopoiesis and Whitehead's process of concrescence. Concrescence can be defined in a simplified way as the real internal constitution of a particular existent, end quote. More technically, concrescence is, quote, the name for the process in which the universe of many things acquires an individual unity in a determinate relegation of each item of the many to its subordination in the constitution of the novel one, end quote, from Process and Reality. Though it is true that, quote, every entity in the actual world of a concrescent actuality has some gradation of real relevance to that concrescence, end quote, in order to attain the unity of subjective satisfaction, the concrescence must simplify the multiplicity of its feelings by way of negative prehensions. A negative prehension is the definite exclusion, quote, the definite exclusion of that item from positive contribution to the subject's own real internal constitution, end quote. Varela says something similar about the autopoietic process of self-realization, remarking that the, quote, stimuli from outside enter the sphere of relevance only by their existential meaning for the keeping of the process of self-establishment, end quote. An element of the actual world incompatible with the subjective aim of an organism is negatively prehended, such that its role becomes negligible, though still actual enough to affect the emotional complex involved in the final satisfaction of the concrescence. We can summarize this point by saying, in Varela's language, that organisms bring forth their own domain of cognitive significance, or again, in Whitehead's, quote, each actual occasion defines its own actual world from which it originates. Before exploring the cosmological significance of our account, we must elucidate the relation between form and matter that has been tacitly assumed above. The classical materialist account is that matter has a fixed essence, cannot evolve, and has no intrinsic potential. It is determined entirely by exterior forces. The emergence of life out of such material would therefore require a miracle, as there is no way to account for individual self-formation without a tendency toward organization present in matter from the beginning. To account for the ontological status of biological identity, for the ever-existing gap between the realization of the living and its underlying matter, end quote, we must move beyond the mechanistic understanding of organisms as genetic substances informed with qualities through passive selection by a pregiven environment. Not only does this ignore the reciprocal role played by organisms in the selection of their environment, it fails to fully consider an organism's moment-to-moment task of having to self-produce itself from a continual flow of matter and energy. The claim is that the genetic program is responsible for the whole process. But as has been pointed out numerous times already, one cannot account for the teleological organization of individual living organisms by reducing their form to that resulting from a mechanical process operating at the level of whole species. To do so is to commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Accounting for the natural purposes of individual organisms does not require that we reject the reality of physiochemical constraints. On the contrary, quote, the organism has to remain in the field of physiochemical laws to maintain a coupling with the underlying energetical structures, autocatalyzing reactions, for instance, end quote, whose regularities assure that it can maintain coupling through the course of its life. In other words, the environment gives the basis for the organism's behavior precisely by establishing a continuous challenge to it, end quote. This point is similar to the one made earlier about the object-subject structure of experience. The basis of subjectivity is a concern for that which transcends oneself. This concern for the other is mirrored by the desire to exist for one's own sake, or as Varela put it, quote, subjectivity is the absolute interest the organism takes in his continued existence, end quote. Varela continues, quote, necessary are the material compounds of an organism, their incessant input, and their unhindered supply. But this necessity is governed by a principle of autonomy, the fact that a living system is able to become an ontological center, that it is able to organize itself into a form that is not explainable by the features of the underlying matter alone. This autonomy, then, is nothing other than true teleological behavior. To understand how organized form could arise from matter, an intrinsic urge toward realization must be attributed to it. The phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, who was a major influence on Varela's thought, spoke of matter as, quote, the flesh of the world, end quote. Quote, it is not self-sensing as is my flesh. It is sensible and not sentient. I call it flesh, nonetheless, in order to say that it is a pregnancy of possibility. End quote. Whitehead uses eros to evoke that, quote, which endows with agency all ideal possibilities and, quote, is the soul stirring itself to life and motion. We might even give a thermodynamic account of this agency or pregnancy of matter, pointing to a particular example, the tremendous temperature gradient created by interaction between the earth and light from the sun. Footnote, that gradient being between 580 and 2.7 Kelvin. This far from equilibrium situation gave the molecules on the surface of the planet a tremendous amount of free energy, allowing them to, quote, spontaneously create new patterns of order and organization by dissipating entropy, close quote. Life, says biologist Lynn Margulis, is a gradient-reducing system. Such a view allows us to see how life does not contradict the second law of thermodynamics, as was once thought. Instead, it feeds on it. We will, footnote, we will continue this discussion on thermodynamics below. An individual life, however, as we said at the outset, is a process with both a beginning and an end. Because the autonomous form of an organism runs counter to the necessarily entropic state of matter, its eventual death is a certainty. But this death is a gift to all subsequent organisms that inherit its objective immortality as components in their own concrescence. Part 6, the living cosmos. If you equate the probability of the birth of a bacteria cell to chance assembly of its atoms, eternity will not suffice to produce one. Faced with the enormous sum of lucky draws behind the success of the evolutionary game, one may legitimately wonder to what extent this success is actually written into the fabric of the universe. End quote. Christian de Duve, from A Guided Tour of the Living Cell. We have attempted in the preceding pages to generalize the quality of life such that it might extend to every actual entity. To have any chance at succeeding, a few conceptual hurdles remain. To truly generalize life, defined as autopoiesis to all actual entities, our analysis of the relation between autopoiesis and concrescence must have revealed enough similarity that the two, as accounts of self-organization, are nearly interchangeable. Whether enough parallels have been drawn to do this remains to be seen. To fully prove that the two processes are deeply related, we would have to describe an entity usually considered inorganic, such as an atom, as an autopoietic system. We are confident that this can be done, but it would require a detailed investigation into the structure of subatomic dynamics that is beyond the scope of the current essay. We can say, however, that in light of the displacement in modern physics of matter by energy as the most fundamental, that atomic organization appears to satisfy the two major requirements of autopoietic organization. 1. Each of its components, protons, neutrons, and electrons, participate in the continual formation of one another, and 2. In the formation of a boundary, or an electron probability cloud, which defines the atom as a unity. Footnote, since the electron cloud is potentially coextensive with the universe, an atom, like all other actual occasions, requires the whole cosmos to be itself. Such an account of the atom is plausible because energy, quote, is merely the name for the quantitative aspect of a